Okay. It is recording now, I guess. That's good. Now let me figure out how to fix. Whatever. That is good enough. So this is my first time back on GetVokl in 4 months, I think. It has been quite a while. And this is also, so I'm trying to fix something as I talk. This is also my first time on GetVokl without a guest. So if I can talk for more than like 10 minutes, it's a win, because I am very introverted, which is why I have some wine. And if I run out of that, I got other stuff. But I could literally go days without talking to the people I live with. And one of those people is my boyfriend, so that tells you a lot. Today, I'm going to talk about the case of Jaryd Atadero. I got all my notes down, so we are going to go through all of those because this case is just one that I cannot grasp. There's nothing that points to a certain theory. There's nothing that points away from a certain theory, and it's just very difficult to figure out this case. Honestly, you'll see what I mean. One disclaimer, I have my office door open because my pets are being like super needy today. So if there's noises, and you have 2 cats and a bunny and 2 mice, so they might be talking or running around. Right now, I think they're all asleep, so I should be good for a little bit, but we will see. Also, about 10 minutes ago, there was someone on the street outside my window yelling at me. So I just ignored it because we're on the 2nd floor and it's Milwaukee, so that happens. But if someone starts yelling again, it's just outside. We don't need to pay attention to it. So Jaryd Atadero went on a hike with his sister and a group of Christian singles, which we'll get into why he was with a group of Christian singles a little bit later. And his father knew that he was going to go on this hike. But when, I'm sorry, I am so much better when I can edit myself. When he went on this, he was only 3 years old. So obviously he was high energy and he ran ahead of the group. And no one really thought anything of it at the time, but that's how he went missing. He ran ahead of the group and no one followed him, and he just never came back. Parts of him came back, but he didn't come back alive, obviously. And this is a case that is in the category of missing 411. A missing 411 case has multiple things that it has to tick off to be considered that. And one of the things is that you go missing either in a national park or a rural area. And there's a few other things, like you can't be thought to have gone away on your own or gone away to commit suicide. And there's a few other things, I don't have them in front of me, but missing 411 cases are very interesting to me. I knew nothing about them a few years ago, and my dad recommended this YouTube channel called, I think it's Bedtime Stories. And the guy who runs this YouTube channel does like creepy stories and he reads them off. And he talked about people going missing in national parks. And from there, I found the Missing 411 documentary and the books, and it just spiraled out of control. 2 weeks from now, I think on the 29th of October, I'm going to do a whole GetVokl episode, I guess you could call it, on missing 411 theories, because there's some crazy theories out there. And if you listen to today's episode on the theories about Dyatlov Pass, some of those theories have to do with missing 411 for obvious reasons, because Dyatlov Pass incident was in a rural area and these people died, and it's technically solved, but it's not solved. And it's very interesting. Anyways, I thought I needed a full day to do just the theories on missing 411. We will go through some theories on the Jaryd Atadero case, though. So, Jaryd's father had purchased a resort in the Colorado wilderness because he enjoyed it and he wanted to be a little more outdoorsy. So, why not? And they ended up moving there. So it was basically an area of land with some cabins. And then there was like a main store food place. And in the back of there was a little apartment. So Jaryd lived here with his father and his older sister. On October 2nd of 1999, Alan, who is Jaryd's father, had a Christian singles group staying at the resort. These people had stayed there before and they knew Alan fairly well, so they were there this time to help with winterizing the resort. On this day, there was 11 or 13 of these Christian singles there. There's differing reports, but as you'll see with this case, a lot of things aren't cut in stone. There's a lot of differing reports. These 11 to 13 people decided they wanted to go do something else for the day. So they found a fish hatchery. I always have trouble saying that. They found a fish hatchery not too far, and they asked if they could take Jaryd's older sister. I believe she was about 6 at the time. And Alan said, yeah, that's fine. And then Jaryd, seeing that his older sister could go, wanted to go as well, obviously. And his father was not okay with this at first. But eventually, Jaryd complained enough that his father was like, yeah, it's fine, just go, just get out. And so one of the ladies was really close to Jaryd's older sister, and she was like, yeah, it's fine if Jaryd comes with, we'll keep watching them, and we won't let anything happen, as you normally assure people's parents when you take their kids. Not when you take their kids. Never mind. Okay, so the group went off in multiple cars because obviously 11 to 13 people do not fit in one car. Well, 11 to 15 people do not fit in one car. And without telling Alan, they decided to go to a place other than the fish hatchery. So they went about 15 miles away from the resort where there was a trailhead called a Big South Trail. This was a 7-mile trail through the Colorado wilderness. The forest was very dense, so it seemed logical enough to the group, I'm assuming, that the children would have to stay on the path. If the forest is too dense, children can't get through it, so they only had the choice to stay on the path. When they started off on this trail, they split into 2 groups, which is the first part of this case where something probably went wrong. To me, it seems like it's the first part where a bad decision was made. So one group was the faster group. They went ahead. The other group was obviously the slower group, so they stayed behind. The children were put with the slower group because children are slow. They got little legs. And eventually, these 2 fishermen who were walking up the trail to go fishing at a spot on the trail walked past the slow group, and Jaryd was very outgoing. So he walked by these fishermen and started asking questions like, are there bears out here? Is there this? Is there that? What are you doing? Why are you doing that? And all that stuff. And no one really thought anything of it. They thought, Jaryd will walk with these fishermen past the slow group, and he will get to the fast group, and somebody will stop him, because that's obviously what you would think. If you saw a kid that you were supposed to be taking care of, you would stop them once you saw them trying to go past you, right? Well, sorry, let me figure out my notes. The group didn't stop him. So the fast group must have seen him go by, because once again, it was just a trail. It seems very difficult to me that was not the right wording. It seems very unlikely, there we go, that the fast group didn't see Jaryd walk past them. That just wouldn't make any sense. And these fishermen kept walking, and until there was a fork in the road. So the fisherman took the left way. Jaryd took the right way on his own. And this was the last time that Jaryd was seen. No one thought to follow him. The fishermen didn't think to follow him, or they didn't think to tell anyone about it. Their reasoning was, these people that are with them are walking this way already. They obviously had to have seen him, so they'll follow him. Which, in the moment, it was probably safe to assume that that would happen. But obviously, it didn't. Some would later report that a little while after Jaryd was last seen, they heard a scream. Some people stated it was a playful scream, like if you're playing tag with a kid and you tag them and they do that weird squeal scream thing. But others would state that it sounded like a terrified scream. And still other people would say, there never was a scream. I didn't hear that. After a little bit of time, the group finally realized that no one had seen Jaryd in a while. So they began to call for him and look for him. They spread out all over the trail and they were just trying to find him, but obviously they could not. So after some time searching for him, some of the people went back to the resort to get Alan. Now, I'm going to read this part because this part is kind of weird. So two women went back to the resort and they burst into the back room, which was the apartment, with the resort manager. And they stated, we have a problem with Jaryd. Alan started to think about maybe he broke a bone, maybe he was having a temper tantrum, something that wasn't that crazy, but that you could expect from a 3-year-old. And then they said something that would be very controversial throughout this entire case. The two women said, he's okay, we just can't find him. So since then, Alan has done a lot of interviews. When his son was still missing, before they found bones and stuff like that, he did a lot of interviews talking about possibilities of what could have happened to Jaryd. And he's always stated that this wording of he's okay, we just can't find him, struck him as very odd. He always said, if you can't find him, how do you know he's okay? And people still look into this a lot today. I kind of see it as these two women were just trying not to alarm Alan too much. They were trying to keep things less panicky. Like when you were a kid, if you hurt someone, you would say, no, they're okay. And obviously they're not okay because they're crying next to you. But it's to bring the panic down. And I don't really see anything wrong with this. But Alan and a lot of people do see a lot wrong with this. So Alan got in the car immediately, and they all went back to Big South Trail. Alan told the resort manager, we don't need to call search and rescue yet. But the resort manager went totally against them and called search and rescue, which in the end was a good idea, but it would not help them out at all in this case. So as they were driving, this is the first time Alan hears that they didn't go to the fish hatchery. They actually went to the Big South Trail. No one had informed him of this, and no one thought to tell him when they went back to the resort. No, we didn't go to the fish hatchery. He's actually missing on a 7-mile trail through the wilderness. When they get there, Alan runs onto the trail and starts calling for Jaryd, thinking hopefully that Jaryd is just hiding somewhere and he thinks it's a game or something along those lines, and that Jaryd will come out when he hears how panicked his dad was. But he didn't. And this is the first time Alan was able to realize how bad this really was. He was on the trail. He looked around the trail. He saw they were in the middle of the wilderness. He saw there was just extremely dense forest, and it was a 7-mile trail. So Jaryd could have gone anywhere. And Alan started to get this big feeling of dread. Thankfully, the resort manager, that's what I'm trying to think of. Thankfully, the resort manager thought to call search and rescue, which in the end, once again, didn't do anything, but it kind of helped, I guess. Sorry, I'm looking at the notes again. So search and rescue came right away. They started to search for Jaryd, and people began to think maybe he ran off and he fell asleep. After all, he was a 3-year-old who didn't get a nap that day. It only makes sense that he would have fallen asleep. So the new plan was that people were going to stay on the trail all night, spaced out, but some people were going to stay on the trail all night in case Jaryd woke up and came stumbling out of the forest. And then they were going to resume searching efforts in the morning. Nothing was found in the morning either. Jaryd did not come out of the woods at all. No one had heard him. No one had seen him. No one had even found like a piece of clothing from him. So after this, a helicopter is finally brought in, but eventually it had to go back to where it came from and refuel. And then upon its second arrival, it crashed, which kind of sets the tone for the rest of the case. This helicopter that was supposed to be searching for Jaryd just crashed. And Alan begins getting calls from people around who knew him, wondering if Jaryd was found because they saw ambulances and fire trucks and whatnot heading that way. But it wasn't until much later that day that Alan was told about the helicopter crash. So law enforcement failed to inform him about the helicopter crash of the helicopter that was supposed to be searching for his son. And then he got false hope and false anxiety, thinking that they had found Jaryd and that there were all these ambulances headed there. And this was just the first of many wrongdoings of the police in this case. So yeah, this is where the law enforcement started to get really sketchy and aggravating, not just for Alan, but for everyone who would look at the case from then on. They started to block off the trail at this time, and they didn't allow anyone on the trail except law enforcement. They wouldn't allow Alan to search. They wouldn't allow friends and family to search. They wouldn't allow volunteers to search. It was only law enforcement from around the area. Alan's family actually flew in from California and wanted to go help search, so they drove down to the trail. When they got to the trail, they were denied. And Alan was back at the resort at this time, and the police had set up the dining area for the resort as their base. So Alan there we go. Alan heard on the radio a cop saying, "We're going to have to arrest the Ataderos if they don't stop causing problems." So Alan was kind of panicked. He's like, "Oh no, what is my family doing? What are they messing with the investigation?" But come to find out, the only thing they were doing was trying to help search the trails. They weren't actually doing anything against the investigation. Police were just being very odd and moody at this time. So the police were refusing help from anyone. The National Guard had even volunteered. Trained dog groups had volunteered to search the area. And a ton of other search and rescue volunteer groups from around the area had volunteered to look for Jaryd, but the police turned them all away. At one point, they even told Alan that they couldn't afford it. They said, "Oh, we're going to have to pay them. And, the police department can't afford that right now." When Alan called the groups back to say this, they were stunned because they said, "We never charge police officers or anyone for our help in searching for missing people." So at this time, the police were just blatantly lying. Around this same time, this is one of the most interesting aspects of the case to me. So I'm going to make sure I read it right. Around this same time, a military tracker happened to be in the area. If you don't know what a military tracker does, it's basically someone who is heavily trained to observe, identify, interpret, and follow physical evidence to track whoever or whatever left this stuff behind. Anyways, this military tracker volunteered to search for Jaryd because he obviously had the skills. Unknowingly, after searching for Jaryd, he went back to Alan's resort, and he was getting food in the cafeteria area, and Alan was the one checking him out. And they started small talk, and the military tracker was like, yeah, I'm just so tired after searching for this kid all day, blah, blah, blah. And Alan was like, oh, I'm his dad. We should, talk about it. And the military tracker's reaction to this was stating, we need to sit down and talk right away. So obviously this kind of upset Alan, or at least made him very curious. So as they sat down, the tracker drew a map of the area, and he put a large X on one part of the map. He told Alan that he had tracked Jaryd to this extremely specific spot in the area, and he had done it multiple times. However, he couldn't get into the spot because it was actually 500 feet vertically, 500 feet up vertically, whatever, and he couldn't climb it. But he had no doubt in his mind this is where Jaryd was. Alan used this information and immediately contacted authorities and asked them to check this area. And authorities refused, saying that the helicopter had already checked it. So there's a few issues with this. Later in the case, we're going to find out that Jaryd, the remains of Jaryd, what was remaining, was found in this exact area. And the other thing is the helicopter wasn't around for that long. It crashed. So how could it have done a good and thorough search? Also, helicopters up here, ground's down here. So if there's little pieces of evidence, the helicopter wouldn't have been able to see them. So it doesn't make sense that the police department was refusing to search the area again. Later into these searches, Alan somehow stumbled upon a report from a park ranger. This ranger stated that he thought very confidently that he had seen Jaryd later on the day he went missing. So the ranger said he saw a boy about Jaryd's age that he believed to be Jaryd with an older man, and the boy kept tugging away from the man and trying to run towards the ranger. However, as most of us would, the ranger just thought this was a little kid who was having a tantrum and just wanted to get away from his parent, And the ranger didn't say that the old man seemed anxious at all. He just seemed like the parent or the grandparent of this kid. However, the ranger later went home, saw the case about Jaryd on his TV, and he was confident that the boy he saw was Jaryd. So at this point, we have a park ranger confirming that Jaryd was with a old man at this time. So at this time, obviously the sheriff is not doing a great job because they didn't bring forth the report about the park rangers seeing Jaryd with another man, and they refused to search certain spots. On top of this, the sheriff actually did an interview or a show for the news or something along those lines. I'm not completely sure exactly what he did, but he was on TV for something. And he thought the cameras were all off when he went up to someone and said, "Are you as tired of this case as I am?" and then started laughing afterward. This is not professional at all for obvious reasons, and especially so in the case of a missing child. This was only 3.5 weeks into the investigation. It's not like they had been investigating this for 10 years and they still weren't getting anywhere, which at that point, it's still not professional, but you could say, they're just getting really frustrated with this case. No, it was 3.5 weeks. So 2 more weird pieces in this case is, one is that they weren't even using Jaryd's scent for the dogs to try and find him. they were using Alan's scent. So they had a pair of Alan's shorts as the piece that they would let the dogs smell before the dogs went off to search for this person, not Jaryd's shorts, which doesn't even make sense because there's a grown man shorts and then a 3-year-old shorts. Those are totally different sizes. How anyone could have mistaken them is beyond me. And I don't know, that could have totally messed up the whole case. If they were using Jaryd shorts, maybe they would have found him far sooner. Another thing is that Alan has stated that at one point, he got a phone call from someone who couldn't reveal their identity, but stated they were working with the sheriff's office that was on the case. This man told Alan that the police were not telling him everything, which at this point was obvious, and that one day this would come out and he would help Alan. But at this point, that's all this man could say. At one point, the police seemed to be getting better. I mean, as much as they can seem to be getting better. And they accepted to let a local search and rescue who knew the area, so they were more likely to be able to scale certain hills, not mountains, I guess, hills and go through the dense forest. And they were scheduled to start the next day. However, that night, law enforcement called this team and said if they showed up tomorrow, they would all be arrested. This group thankfully worked around the system and all went individually dressed as civilians so that they could volunteer. And law enforcement would not know that they were part of this original search and rescue team, which it kind of adds, it's good that they were letting volunteers come search. They weren't just having law enforcement search. But why would you let random volunteers search and not let an experienced search and rescue group search unless you were hoping nothing was found? If you wanted something to be found, you would want the experienced people to search for it. That's just how that logically lays out. So right around this time, a congressman also came to help with some searches. One day he started talking to Alan, and he stated he had gotten a call at his office, and this caller was anonymous, but he told the congressman, if you know what's good for you, you're not going to show up for the search. So whether the sheriff's department was doing this or not, somebody was intimidating everyone who wanted to search for Jaryd. So somebody out there was trying to make sure nothing of Jaryd or his case was ever figured out. And just from the evidence, it seems like whoever this was working for the sheriff's department, or it was just the sheriff's department as a whole. Upon finding nothing in these searches, police started to throw out theories on what could have happened to Jaryd. The main one was that Jaryd probably drowned, and because the water was so cold, he wouldn't surface in 4 years. 4 years is a very specific timeline. When you look at the seasons, generally, seasons happen every year, not every 4 years. So why would the water be that cold to where he wouldn't surface in 4 years? In the book I wrote, I went over, all of these men were found in rivers or other waterways. And yeah, some of them didn't surface for months because the water's so cold, you don't start floating because the decomposition isn't rapid enough for you to get bloated and float. But 4 years is not a timeline for that. There is no reason someone would not surface for 4 years. It doesn't make sense. So let's skip to 4 years after Jaryd went missing, because that is the next kind of piece of information. And it'll kind of go along with the river theory towards the end. You'll see. So 2 hikers were climbing 500 feet vertically about 2 miles away from the head of the trail. Now, this is referencing back to where the military tracker stated Jaryd most definitely was, 500 feet vertically, 2 miles from the head of the trail. When they got there, they found children's clothing. And obviously, they were like, this is not okay. We need to call the police. So the police showed up, and Alan showed up, and he identified that this was, in fact, Jaryd's clothing. These clothes did not look like they had been out in the wilderness. When you're thinking about clothes that someone either wore or, like, even if Jaryd had died directly after he went missing and these clothes were just out in the wilderness for 4 years, they didn't look like that. They were clean and they were not torn. They looked like someone had pretty much just taken them off. A lot of people think a very weird part is that the pants were found inside out. But let's think about when you take off your pants. I don't know if I just do it stupidly, but when I take off my pants, they turn inside out because I'm too lazy to like try and like shimmy them down my leg and like pull the bottom. You know, it just doesn't make sense. So if I'm a 21-year-old who is taking off my pants like that, what's to say a 3-year-old doesn't take his pants off and then they come inside out for some reason? People seem to focus on this a little too much, and they're like, somebody had to take his clothes off for him. Like, why was it inside out? But he's 3 years old. There's no rhyme or reason to wear, like, how he takes his pants off. So I don't think it's that weird. These clothes were examined, and it was found that absolutely no blood and no decomposition liquids were found on the clothes. And there were absolutely no animal bites. If an animal had dragged him up this cliff, If an animal had dragged him up this cliff, as many people first speculated, there would have been blood because this animal would have bitten him. There would have at least been holes in the clothes, but there also would have been blood. Sorry, the people who live below me like to scream at their dogs all the time. So there was no blood, and there was no way for Jaryd to get 500 feet vertical by himself. He was a 3-year-old. And that's why people turn to the idea of an animal dragging him up this cliff. But there was nothing supporting this. Strange hairs were also found on the collar of Jaryd's shirt by Alan. But Alan was not allowed to see the results of the tests done on this hair. He was only told that it was not human hair and it was not mountain lion hair. If law enforcement was able to make this distinction and say it's not human hair and it's not mountain lion's hair, that kind of tells me they knew what kind of hair it was. Otherwise, you couldn't make that very specific distinction of, no, it's not mountain lion hair. But they never came forward with anything else stating what the hair was or even what it could be. Not long after this evidence came out, people started to question, like, if the clothes were there, why were no bones found? And very conveniently, a week after the clothing was found, part of his cranium and a tooth was found in the exact same area. So apparently, just searchers didn't see the tooth and part of his skull when they were out there looking specifically for remains of a child. The tooth was also sitting perfectly on top of a pile of pine needles, like it had been placed there after someone like pushed together the pine needles. So that's great. So the finding of these things does relate back to that military tracker. This evidence was only 30 feet away from where the military tracker said Jaryd would be found. This bone and tooth weren't even confirmed to be Jaryd's until 2 years later. This was the third DNA test that they went through. Generally, it doesn't take 3 DNA tests. Generally, you can do it fairly quickly, especially with teeth. But took 3 DNA tests. The first one, done by local law enforcement, was an 86% match to Jaryd. But Alan wanted another test, so he sent the skull to someone in Ohio. But conveniently, the first test that local law enforcement did on the tooth destroyed the tooth. So they couldn't send it to the person in Ohio. The Ohio test shown that DNA tests were inconclusive. So local law enforcement would have had no way to state that it was 86% match to Jaryd. And this is what the person in Ohio said. He said there's no way that they could have stated this was an 86% match. I don't know how they did that or why they did that. Local law enforcement also failed to tell Alan that there was 2 people's DNA on the tooth. When I first heard this, I was kind of shocked. I was like, well, if there's 2 people's DNA, then it's most likely Jaryd's and the person who killed him or at least kidnapped him. But I found out Alan said himself, he admitted to this, he was on the mountain right after these things were found, and he asked if he could hold the tooth, and officials let him do this. So in my opinion, it was probably just Alan and Jaryd's DNA on this tooth if Alan held it. But if it wasn't Alan's DNA, that was the second DNA, then that could have solved the case. And I don't know why they didn't bring this up sooner, and I don't know if they even kept the DNA in file because the tooth was destroyed. After receiving news that this was in fact Jaryd's bones, the scratches on the skull had to be looked into next. There were a few scratches on the piece of cranium that Jaryd's dad had. And I believe you can find pictures online. If you can't find pictures, there's definitely videos on YouTube because Jaryd's father carries the skull piece with him, which is kind of odd, but it's the last thing he has of his son, so I'm not here to judge. He doesn't carry it everywhere, obviously, but when he goes to places to talk about Jaryd's case, he brings it with him. So there's videos of him showing it on the internet. So let me see. So a woman messaged Alan, and she stated she was a doctor, and she knew exactly where these scratches had come from. She said that they were from a riverbed, which makes sense. If Jaryd's body if he was dead and it sunk to the bottom of the river and there was a bunch of rocks and pebbles, yeah, I could get scratches on his skull. That makes total sense. But then Alan questioned, how did this piece of the skull get so high up? Remember, it was 500 vertical feet and 2 miles away from the beginning of the trailhead. This doctor stated that it was probably a flash flood and that the skull went in the flash flood to get to the top of the mountain. And this is exactly when Ellen stopped buying her story. A flash flood going 500 vertical feet it's not a flash flood. That's a full out insane flood. There was no record of that, and it didn't happen. And after Ellen called her out for this, she completely stopped responding because she obviously knew she was wrong in this sense. And I don't know if it was someone who just kind of wanted the notoriety, who messaged Jaryd Atadero's father like, oh, I know what happened, and then made stuff up, or if it was planned and she did this to try and throw Alan off the trail. Either way, it's insanely stupid that she or anyone else thought this would fool Alan, because obviously a flood with 500 vertical feet of water did not happen. So there's so many pieces of information in this case, and there are so many theories that stem from this. So let's go into following the breadcrumbs. First, law enforcement stopped letting other people work on the searches. Then they start refusing help from even people who were qualified and who knew the area. They even refused help from the National Guard. Next, they come up with an explanation as to how Jaryd died and why they weren't finding anything, saying he would conveniently appear 4 years later. And then almost 4 years on the dot, his clothes were found somewhere that Jaryd could not have gotten to on his own. Then, when people start to question why none of his remains were found with his clothing, suddenly a tooth and a piece of his skull show up where his clothing once was. Then the tooth had multiple DNA on it, and it was accidentally destroyed in the first round of DNA testing. Then someone emailed Alan to try and tell him that the scratches were from a riverbed, and then there was an insane flood not more than like 20 miles away from where Alan lived, even though there is nothing to support that. Now, I'm not saying it was a police cover-up, but it absolutely sounds like the police were trying to cover something up. There are so many theories here. There's theories saying Jaryd was abducted by UFOs and then dropped years later, and that could explain why the clothing looked so new. There's theories that police found this evidence right away and then hid it because they did something wrong and then brought it back out 4 years later to miraculously explain what happened to Jaryd. There's also theories that go with the Ranger's accounts. But if Jaryd was with this old man that the Ranger claimed to see him with, how would the old man get up the mountain? There are just so many endless theories to this. I think the point in which we could know more about this case would have been if we knew what type of DNA was on the tooth with Jaryd's DNA. Also, what was the hair on the clothing? If it wasn't human and there was no sign of an animal attack, that pretty much counts out everything. What was the hair then? Because the only two kinds of hair I know are human and animal. A lot of people use that to give something to the UFO theory. I don't think that's what's happening here. I think that the police are just trying to cover it up. But if it was an animal attack, it doesn't make sense. It had to be some sort of human intervention, because the two theories of how Jaryd could have gotten up on that cliff are an animal brought him up there or a human brought him up there. If it wasn't an animal, since there's no blood, no hair, nothing that supports the theory of an animal attack, then it had to be human intervention. It couldn't have been the old man that the Ranger supposedly saw Jaryd with, because that guy was old, and an old man could not have done this climb, especially trying to get a kid up there. So that doesn't leave us with a lot of information. All we really know is that Jaryd went off on the right fork of the path on his own, and 4 years later, after a lot of fighting with law enforcement, his clothes were found, and then conveniently, one piece of his skull and one tooth was found. And then the tooth was destroyed. I don't know. It doesn't look good for the police in this case, because there is absolutely no reason that tooth should have been completely destroyed, and there is no reason for a lot of the things they did. But if you are interested in more of the Jaryd Atadero case, you can Google it and tons of stuff pop up. Interviews with his dad, Alan, pop up. Interviews with people who established the missing 411 theories pops up. And it's probably the most puzzling case within the missing 411 category that I've come across. There's a lot of other crazy ones like Dior Kunz Jr. and Stephen Kubacki and Dr. Maurice Domitz. But the Jaryd Atadero case, just nothing adds up. In these other ones, there's stuff like, oh, maybe this could have happened, maybe this could have happened. It's not completely crazy. There's theories that make sense, but the Jaryd Atadero case has absolutely no theories that make sense. So take that as you will. And follow us on Twitter at Great Unsolved. Follow us on Instagram at Great Unsolved Pod. We have a Facebook group. Don't know how to access that, but it's in our links in our bio. I will also be at CrimeCon in London in June, which I think is June either 12th and 13th or 13th and 14th. I don't have the calendar in front of me right now. But if you are in London or you are planning to go and you want to get 10% off your ticket, use code GreatUnsolved21. It's in all caps, and that'll get you 10% off your tickets. Anyways, I will see you back. Well, I won't see you, but you'll hear me back tomorrow for our 16th day of 31 Days of Crime, because I do a new episode every day in October. Thank you for joining me for my first GetVokl back. Next week, I am doing my favorite cults, which sounds weird, but you'll see what I mean. Then we are going over theories that have to do with missing 411. And then on Halloween around 2 p.m., I am going to do Reddit ghost stories and stuff like that just for fun. So I hope to see you back on here then.